Welcome to the Expanding on Consciousness podcast. I am Mark Certo, and I can't tell you how happy I am to know that you're out there listening today. This podcast is dedicated to exploring the myriad aspects of this thing that we call consciousness. We all have it. It's ubiquitous, mysterious, and something that many people actually take for granted. This podcast is devoted towards changing that paradigm of taking consciousness for granted. Like all gifts, it's easy to take them for granted if you expect them. But each one of us knows that at some point, the gift that is your personal consciousness will one day change. Some say it'll cease forever someday. Others say that it'll shift into something different. And others hold that consciousness is eternal. There are a lot of different thoughts on consciousness. Some say consciousness is a byproduct of brain functions. Some say that consciousness is personal, the product of sensory input and memory. Some say that consciousness is also a sea in which we swim. So I'm not here to tell you what you should be thinking about your personal experience of consciousness or how to use it. My job has always been to help you find new ways to explore it. If you choose to do so, you may discover something about yourself and how you use consciousness personally, in addition to discovering something more about yourself and the other forms of consciousness that you interact with daily, like the people in your life, the situations in your life, and perhaps life itself. To help me do that, we will be discussing consciousness on this podcast with some of the best minds on the planet. Our guests all have a unique perspective on this thing we call consciousness. This archival series contains conversations that I've actually had in the past with some of those brilliant minds. Some of the guests in this series are fortunately still with us and still actively continuing their research and exploration. Some of them, however, have left us, and I was fortunate enough through the years to get their ideas documented on audio. There are certain people who've contributed to the conversation about consciousness that I consider giants. One of those extraordinary people is Dr. Edgar Mitchell. Ed was a writer, a consciousness explorer, and a scientist, and he also happened to be the sixth man to walk on the moon. Now, I've met quite a few celebrities in my life, but the chance to meet, hang out with, and chat with Ed was always a transcendent experience for me. I was kind of a space junkie as a kid, and I followed the Apollo missions with fascination. Many of us did. Once upon a time, the exploration of space was captivating the imagination of humanity like nothing else could. Nowadays, many people take it for granted. But at the time of the Apollo missions, human consciousness was kind of at a bifurcation point. So these trips to the moon gave us all a brand new perspective on just how amazing life on planet Earth was, and how from the perspective of being 250,000 miles away from Earth, one could notice how incredibly fragile and unique this planet really is. How everything on the Earth was completely connected and seemed interdependent. The boundaries just disappeared from that perspective. That knowledge was brought to us in part through the Apollo missions, and the message was not lost on me as a kid. NASA was a branch of science which gave new credibility to what the mystics spoke on ages ago. And this new perspective set us all on a new consciousness trajectory, one that I think is still in motion. So Ed was already a giant in my eyes when we first met, but his status grew even more in my mind when I heard him speak about his life after Apollo. Ed founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is an organization of brilliant minds all dedicated to a greater understanding of human consciousness. Ed applied his knowledge of physics to a realm of metaphysics, which is a branch of science that is often rejected by quote-unquote conventional science, who perceive it as being mystical mumbo-jumbo. But in truth, the word meta implies the concept of something more than, something from a greater perspective. So I never quite understood why that outright rejection exists, but there you have it. Ed, however, was not at all shy about his curiosity. He was very open about it. After his experience of re-entry from the Apollo 14 mission, he dived right into the deeper mysteries of consciousness. He talks about it in this upcoming interview. He was attempting to discover, in my opinion, how it was that human beings are all connected. We feel so separate on the Earth. He also wanted to know how all life on Earth was connected, and how the mysteries of consciousness could be applied in new ways to expand the human potential. to come to know something more about ourselves. I always got the impression that he was trying to keep the trajectory moving in the right direction. So I met Ed a few times, and I always enjoyed listening to him speak. One of my finest memories was listening to him and a few others who were involved in the space program. They were railing against the growing idea that the moon landings never happened, that they were faked. It's an idea that still is out there in the world. For these guys, however, this nonsense was a personal affront to all of those who dedicated their entire lives to that Apollo mission. I find the whole idea to be nonsense myself, but it was wonderful to hear these guys struggle with how they could combat this weird and growing theory. They also considered this theory as being one of the many ways in which consciousness could be hijacked through spreading false information. It was a fascinating conversation. Ed was also one of those immensely encouraging people who believed that if one applied consciousness in the right way, one's personal life could and would be changed forever. That suffering in general on the planet would become lessened. That one's potential could be reached regardless of any circumstances. That all of it was really just a question of will and focus, which, to me, Ed seemed to have in abundance. He was truly a self-actualized person who became self-realized through following his North Star, which was to go into space and actually walk on the moon. In my opinion, he sets an example for us in many, many ways. And like so many other heroes on the hero's journey, he brought back something of extreme value from his journeys. And he didn't stop there either. As an explorer, he continued, "In my eyes, that makes him a giant upon whose shoulders we stand." So I hope you enjoy this conversation. It was done with the technology of the time, which was over the phone, so the audio quality isn't crystal clear, but I did my best with my recording skills to make every word at least audible. So without further delay, here's the conversation I had with Dr. Edgar Mitchell over 25 years ago. My guest today is Dr. Edgar Mitchell. He's a fascinating man whose life experiences are to truly be admired. In addition to being in the world history books as being the sixth man to walk on the moon during the Apollo 14 mission, he's also a scientist, an author, and a very profound thinker. Dr. Mitchell, thank you so much for being on the show with us today.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure.
Well, the pleasure is indeed mine. I've been looking forward to this. We met during the... May I call you Ed?
Sure, by all means.
Thank you. We met during a conference that you gave at the Monroe Institute in which you were the keynote speaker. During that address, you outlined some of the phenomenal new ways of looking at the constructs of the universe, all of which I really want to share with our listeners. But before we get into that, I have to ask you a question that I'm sure that you've been asked a million times. What was it like out there on the moon and through your space explorations on Apollo 14? I just can't fathom what that'd be like.
As an explorer, Mark, that had to be the height of an explorer's dream, to go where humans have never been, to experience territory that no footprints have been on before, no one has seen up close. Certainly, and to fly an exotic machine that had never been flown before. That's kind of the height of an explorer's and a test pilot's career.
Well, in your book, Way of the Explorer, you describe a fantastic experience that you had upon the reentry to the Earth from the Apollo 14 mission. You suddenly had what some might call an epiphany. Would you mind telling us that story?
Sure. It was the experience, rather, on the way back from the moon, having a reduced workload, a successful mission having been accomplished, to look at the heavens from that extraterrestrial perspective, and to just contemplate it. Now, having a MIT PhD in aeronautics and astronautics, I knew about stars and stellar formation and astronomy and galactic formation and these sorts of things. But it was very apparent as I looked at it that it became very personal. I realized the molecules of my body and the molecules of that spacecraft had been prototyped in an ancient generation of stars. And suddenly it became very, very personal instead of just an intellectual exercise. And I realized that the universe is an intelligent process. It was an insight, and it was accompanied by a euphoria, an ecstasy, if you will. And I realized that our science was incomplete in its cosmology, and that our cultural traditions, normally based around religion, are archaic and incomplete, perhaps flawed as well. And the idea was, here we are, a spacefaring civilization now, after about 4,000 years of recorded history. And we need a new story about ourselves because the old stories aren't correct.
Yes.
And that was the essence of the experience. And I began to wonder, what sort of a brain, mind, body is this that allows one just to see something from a new perspective, have this ecstatic experience, and recognizing that there's something wrong with the way you're understanding it. You have to rethink your whole process to understand it in a better way. We take our brain, mind, body for granted, and suddenly here was a new experience. It just kind of blew me away.
So your experience up there was you saw the universe as being like an organized energy, and
yes,
that we
more
had
of an organism, to follow the Gaia concept, by the way, that Dr. James Lovelock published about Earth and its environment being more like an organism. I saw the entire universe that way. An intelligent, virtually self-organizing system.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that? During your talk, you began to describe the effects that we have on the universe as an evolving system. You begin to talk about the concepts of local perception versus non-local perception,
Right.
and that you have seen an evolutionary pattern in that. Would you describe that?
Well, certainly from the Cartesian or the Newtonian system of thought, body and mind were separate things, and were really two different realms of reality. But what we now understand, particularly from quantum physics, is that those realms interact, and that mind and body are two faces of the same thing, rather than two separate things, and that there is an interaction between them. In other words, mind affects matter, and the evolution of matter affects mind as well. So it's an interactive system, and we are participatory in it, which is quite different than the older modes of looking at it.
And how does that tie in quantum physics in your model?
Well, we have to start with quantum physics. Now that in this century we have understood, gone deep into matter, and found at the subatomic level it doesn't obey the Newtonian classical physics, a whole new physics has emerged that recognizes that all matter is not just particles, that it has a wave aspect to it that is non-local, which means the particle is here, but the wave is everywhere. In other words, just like the mystic has been saying for several thousand years, the universe is totally interconnected in some mysterious way, and that we're all interconnected in some mysterious way. Well, physics of this century has helped us understand how that is, and we've hashed it over and struggled with it for almost 80 years now. And the new science is emerging that helps us understand that interconnectedness as to how, for example, thought is not just contained to our head. It's a ubiquitous process here. And that's quite a different way of looking at it than we've ever looked at it before.
Well, this tying factor that you see within this interconnectivity between thought and physical process, how do you define that?
Well, let's start with the basic process. Physicists discovered this property called nonlocality. It was evident right in the beginning of quantum mechanics back in the 1920s, but it was only definitively shown in the laboratory and accepted in 1982. And what that means is that two particles ever in a process, and they go their separate ways, flying across the universe, they still remain quantum correlated, which means certain quantum properties have to know what each other's doing, and I use quotes around that word know.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, there is an interconnection between them regardless of where they are in the universe. Well, we know that at the particle level. We now understand that at the level of matter and of bodies and in brains, that they're interconnected too in a more sophisticated, complicated way by something we now call the quantum hologram, which has only been really discovered in the last few years.
And what exactly do you mean by the quantum hologram?
To explain that, folks need to think about a normal hologram, which is made with coherent laser light by splitting the beams and photographing something and then recombining the beams. But bottom line is, on stage shows and on television, and we've all seen, say, the magician using his tiger, conducting his tiger and doing tricks with him on the stage and making him disappear and so on. That can be done with a hologram, which is just an image of the tiger. You can put your hand through it. It's not there, but you can see it. A quantum hologram follows the same rules, but it's a natural part of matter. It's now known and being discovered that nature has been using all along. The best way to describe it is at the bottom of all matter is energy. And all energy is in constant quantum exchange. Instead of being like little ping pong balls connected by Tinker Toy sticks, which is our normal molecular model,
right.
It's really bundles of energy connected by the attractive forces of the other bundles of energy. And it's in continual dynamic exchange with the environment. Little quantum fluctuations, it's called emission and reabsorption, are continually in dynamic exchange with each atom and each molecule. And that emission-absorption phenomenon is just quantum fluctuation. And it provides a dynamic base for matter. It's not little hard stuff like atomic theory initially thought. It is moving, dynamic stuff.
Ever-evolving, you mean?
Huh?
Ever-evolving, you mean?
Ever-evolving, but always exchanging its energy, being renewed with energy from the quantum zero-point field.
It sounds like there's a feedback process going on there.
It is a feedback process, exactly.
Huh.
Now, it turns out that those emissions of energy, those spontaneous emissions of energy from every body, in every physical body, is sufficiently coherent to be called a quantum hologram. And so each physical object has co-located with it and surrounding it its own hologram made up from quantum fluctuations. Now, a hologram is a very information-rich medium. It's the most information-rich medium we know. And it turns out that the quantum hologram of every physical object carries its entire event history. And so it seems like nature doesn't lose its experience or its information. And that information is non-local, which means it's propagates throughout the universe, but not in space-time. In other words, there's something very interesting here, that there's a resonance that defies space-time, which is what this quantum correlation demonstrated 15 years ago. So we can suddenly say that all of these experiences that humans have had, that modern science or classical science said just didn't exist, and the sixth sense, by which we seem to know things that beyond our body, the sixth sense really ought to be called the first sense, because it's rooted in this quantum hologram.
I see. And when you're talking about the experiments that had taken place some 15 years ago, are those the leaf experiments you're talking about?
It's normally referred to as the aspect experiment,
okay,
or Bell's theorem, a demonstration of Bell's theorem, which was really precisely and well done by Alan Aspect in Paris in 1982, and well accepted by the community of physics. And this notion of non-locality, or the interconnectedness of the universe as a result of this experiment, is really a revolutionary concept. It's helping us explain things we could never explain before.
Like our effect on the universe and our reality constructs.
Right. Yeah. Now, we've got a lot of work to do before this idea is fully integrated into the science and before all the ramifications are understood. But, for example, I often say in my lectures that what we call the sixth sense should really have been called the first sense, mm-hmm. because it was around long before we even evolved. The planetary environment evolved the five senses by which we experience our environment. So, and because it's rooted in this quantum correlation. And in macro scale things like bodies and tables and chairs and cars and planets and so forth, the quantum hologram is the macro scale equivalent of that simple particle quantum correlation. And that's a real wow. That's helping us explore and understand the mysteries that the mystics have always talked about. Mm-hmm. Because fundamentally the brain is a quantum object, and our thoughts are like quantum fluctuations in the brain. We call them thoughts, but what they are is really electrical impulses, which begin with a quantum fluctuation. And so all of a sudden we're really getting down to the very nitty-gritty of what all of this numinous, mystical, parapsychological, psychic experiences are all about. The discovery and the starting to apply this notion of a quantum hologram to these human experiences. I've had for many, many years the notion that something was going on here. Mm-hmm. Now, normal classical science has tended to say that's all mystical nonsense.
Right.
It has no reality at all, that you're just hallucinating.
Right.
But I took the position, have taken the position always, no, humans are having the real experience. We may not be describing it or understanding it correctly, mm-hmm. but there's a real experience going on here.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe not able to quantify it scientifically.
Or even describe it properly, much
right.
less quantify it.
Right.
And that's what it's turned out to be, that it looks like this recently discovered mechanism called the quantum hologram does offer the best explanation, and it looks like the correct explanation for all of these types of insightful, beyond-the-body, non-local experiences that we humans have reported. And been sure we were experiencing something, and certainly we were, but the question was what? Mm-hmm. And this seems to provide a new avenue of understanding all that.
Okay, well, taking into account what you were saying before about the universe expanding and evolving through this feedback process, that all of this information is somehow recorded, let's say in the great data bank in the skies.
Yeah, I sometimes use the giant hard disk in the sky.
That actually works very well.
But, some of the mystics, the ancient mystics, call it the Akashic record.
Okay.
How could, for example, a person like Edgar Cayce or any other seer or any other deeply intuitive person, is the word I prefer to use, mm-hmm. seem to know something about a person or even an ancient person, and some of this has been very verifiable, mm-hmm. When they know nothing about them at all. Well, this concept of the quantum hologram would permit us to understand that.
And exactly how do you see that happening?
Well, in the same sense that radio waves and television waves are going through our bodies every day, mm-hmm. We can't pick it up in our head, except, some people have pick up radio signals,
right, sure.
braces on their teeth, but we don't pick up television signals. But if we have a television antenna sitting right here, we can pick up those signals. The same thing is true about a quantum hologram. It's going through us all the time, too. But that is exactly what we're picking up, it would appear, when we get deeply intuitive, train ourselves, and get into perceiving non-local information. And see, information is just patterns of energy. And the quantum hologram is just a pattern of energy.
Okay, I'm following you right up to the point of where we talk about things like precognition. When you get into futurism, how does that fit into the model?
Well, as a matter of fact, in general, precognition cannot exist. What does happen, though, it appears that the people who, and I'll have to explain time a little to explain that, but the people who seem to be perceiving information from the future are really perceiving the now, but they're also perceiving a relatively stable process. So it's like a stable process is, for example, like the Earth going around the sun.
Mm-hmm.
It goes around pretty routinely once a year.
Yeah.
And so if you know where it is this year, you know where it's going to be next year. So people that are intuitive and can perceive an expanded now can, with this marvelous thing we have, a brain-mind computer, see where that's headed. In other words, project where it's going, but what they're picking up is right now, the tendencies, the movements of now. You see, there's several reasons to say precognition in the general sense, the long-term sense, isn't true. Number one, we know that the further out in time these psychic predictions take place, the less accurate they are.
Okay.
Well, that's the probabilities of the universe. Also, the fact that we're a choosing species, and nature is choosing. Volition is real. We choose to change our future. We choose this course instead of that course.
It's not a stable process, then.
It is not a deterministic process.
Okay.
That's the old classical Newtonian physics, that it was a deterministic process, that if you knew all the positions and velocities of the particles in the universe at once, then you would know what the entire future was going to be. Well, that's not true.
Right.
So as a result, the future is not determinable because the universal processes are made up of irreversible processes which can't go but one way toward the future. So no information can come from the future. It hasn't been created yet. However, when we are very perceptive and we tune in on a stable process, and we humans are sometimes stable and sometimes not stable, if we're very set in our ways, well, we just proceed on the same routines all the time, we're pretty predictable. But if you're not predictable, and by and large we're not predictable, you can't really tell what the future is. But if we have something in our mind that we're prepared and planning to do, and we go ahead and carry it out, then a psychic can pick that up and say, well, so this is going to happen to you. Well, it is, because that's what you're doing. What it means is that they're looking at a relatively stable, predictable process rather than an unstable, unpredictable process.
Okay, we're covering a lot of bases here, and I want to make sure that we stay on track.
All right.
Right now, I've got this picture in my head of, I mean, I've met and dealt with some pretty intuitive people, we'll call them. People who may not be able to predict 20 years into the future, but can, to some degree expand their concepts of now time and move into, say, 1 year into the future. Based on what you were saying before about it being a stable process, knowing myself being open to change at any 5 minutes, depending on my input, how is it that they can, within your constructs here, be able to predict some semblance of what will happen?
Well, when we're really perceiving, we're not perceiving it in a linear fashion. When we're talking about the subconscious processes now, and let's say picking up the quantum hologram, it carries the intentionality, it carries the entire history of whatever object you're talking about. And that direction, call it a vector, if you will, is headed in a particular direction. Now, unless that individual changes their mind in some way, they will contend to go in that direction. Now, the further we get out in time, and generally beyond a few days or a few weeks, we're by and large not really that predictable.
Right. Well, any number of events that can happen that can change the course of our quote-unquote destiny.
Sure, absolutely. Events can happen, and we can make choices. that turn us radically in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
So, see, you can't have it in principle both ways. You can't have a deterministic universe in which the future is known and choosing in which you can choose. It's just, those are mutually exclusive concepts. However, they go together in that there are some processes that are relatively stable.
Mm-hmm.
So they are more predictable than very unstable processes that are changing directions all the time.
Well, I'm also hearing a flavor of synchronicity as a concept within this.
Yep.
If the universe is an expanding and evolving process, and we are part of that expanding, evolving process,
right.
And if when we change our minds and put thought into, send it out to the Akashic record or the great data bank in the sky,
yep.
that the universe begins to form itself to
around that concept.
I see. So is it possible then that the people who are in tune or intuitively based are able to pick up on probable chances based upon the energy that they feel from
Well,
you?
that's exactly what they're doing. They're seeing the direction and saying, well, if it keeps, although they may not be consciously saying this, what they're doing is saying, well, it's going in this direction. It's probably going to continue in this direction within a certain error.
Mm-hmm.
Now, many prophecies turn out to be self-fulfilling prophecies. I put the idea in your head that such and such is going to happen, then you proceed and go and make it happen.
All right. There's this continuous energy that's poured into it that seems to reach critical mass.
In other words, it's a feedback, interactive system here.
Mm-hmm.
I give you an idea, and that strikes home with you. You're going to bring that idea to fruition. So that's essentially, if I say, Mark, you're going to make $1 million in the next 2 years.
Love that idea.
And you like that idea, and all you got to do is go for it. You're likely to make that come true. It's not because without that you would necessarily have made $1 million, but you are assisting in the process in creating that reality.
So the intention of my own intention to make $1 million would have that effect.
Absolutely.
And
buy into that process.
And what about your intention in that, in joining with me?
Well, by helping you put more energy into it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say that was the scenario. If I told you that's what you were going to do and you believed me,
mm-hmm.
and you jumped in and joined in with that process, then you'd set off and do it yourself.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And with your help, I'm sure I could accomplish anything. There seems to be this feeling of resonance that works, and you even mentioned the word before.
That's the word.
Is this an intentional process, or is this just something that occurs naturally?
Resonance is the natural process we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
When I talk about the quantum hologram, for example, it is resonant with the objects, the physical objects to which it's attached.
Mm-hmm.
When we tune in, let's say when a psychic tunes in to something else or someone else, we can truly say they are in resonance with them.
Mm-hmm.
And that is exactly how the information is acquired. The perception is acquired by someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Is that they are resonating with that individual, or we could say the information about that individual, which we call the quantum hologram. Mm-hmm. And it is truly a resonance. It's the right idea.
And this resonance, does it feel like it needs to be on a conscious level, or does it take place subconsciously? Or
well, of course, it takes place subconsciously, but the more you can bring it to conscious awareness, then the more useful it is to you. Mm-hmm. We've all had the vague gut feeling of malaise or something's not right,
sure.
Or we've had a internal gut feeling of, hey, I feel wonderful about that. Well, you're doing that at a subconscious, visceral level. Now, when you can bring an understanding of it to the conscious level, now you're operating on all cylinders. In other words, you've got it both in the subconscious and the conscious. Most people, because of our cultural upbringing and because of the way science has looked at these things for the last 100 years or more, has tended to say, oh, that's just imaginary stuff. That's not real. So we have forced it out of our conscious thought. It's not in our paradigm, if you will. It's not in our belief system. So it's still functioning at the subconscious level, but when we start to understand it, we bring it to the conscious level. So it's operating both, what I would say, left and right brain, for example.
Sure. With all of your experiences, how do you define consciousness?
Tough one, Mark, a tough one. But within the English language definition, consciousness in the dictionary sense is being aware of our being aware, which really means being able to self-reflect. In other words, Homo sapiens is a self-reflective species. And so when we say the word consciousness, it implies that type of perception, that we can think about our thinking, and if we're really good, we can think about our thinking about our thinking, and some people can even go thinking about thinking about thinking about thinking.
My brain is hurting already.
Right.
I was thinking.
But it's hard to get past that. This is called the infinite regress, and it's a little tough to get past about 3 reflections in that hall of mirrors and keep it straight. However, there's other, perception and consciousness can't really be confined in that way. And this is where we've gone wrong since the Cartesian dualism of the late 17th century, early 17th century, sorry. Descartes came to the conclusion that mind and body were separate things, and that thought was all that there really was proof of our existence. Well, it's more complicated than that. We know that the higher primates, they may not be as far evolved in this self-reflective capability as we are, but there's all sorts of evidence and experiments that show that the great apes and the chimpanzees do have a certain amount of self-reflective capability. Likely the dolphins do too. As we go down the chain of organizational complexity, it's clear that animals think, particularly the animals with a well-developed brain, think and solve problems, but they don't necessarily reflect upon those problems or map them in any way.
I see. Okay.
So the next level down from self-reflective awareness would simply be self-awareness. And what that means is that the organism can distinguish itself as being different from the environment that it's in. In other words, it has a self-identity.
Like everything is outside of me, for instance.
Yeah.
Okay.
And now that is a learned characteristic, it appears, that when the infant is born, it is not self-aware, but the initial stages of development is to decide where do I stop and the environment begins. For example, the baby touches the hot stove, gets burned, pulls the hand back, and it's not the same as me.
Sure.
That hot stove isn't me. So the initial experiences of all infants, of all species, is to discover exactly that and start to operate as a me in the environment, not as a me a part of the environment. And that's the self-awareness. The next level down, certainly with living systems that don't have a brain, like very low-order organisms, plants, yogurt, bacteria, brine shrimp. There's experiments been done on all these various tissue and cells. They have awareness, but not self-awareness. Now, there were wonderful experiments just 25 or so years ago that Cleve Baxter did with plants, yogurt bacteria, brine shrimp, that showed you could isolate them in Faraday cages, which exclude electromagnetic signals, and perform an experiment either to threaten or to nourish a specimen outside the test, and find reactions by having electrodes and things on those inside the Faraday box. So
So there seems to be
This is resonance and non-locality taking place, but the specimens were not individuated. They weren't considering themselves separate. So the threat or the nourishment of one was experienced by the other one. But the level of awareness is simple awareness. It doesn't differentiate itself into the I-thou or the environment and the other. I mean the self and the other. So there's 3 levels of awareness, or consciousness, if you want to call it that, that we can easily identify. The question arises that if that level of consciousness exists in the animate world, and it does not appear that consciousness or awareness itself is a product of organizational complexity, then one must ask, how far down the chain of organizational complexity does awareness go? Until it disappears in the inanimate object. But since it can't arise there, it has to, in some form, be in the basis of nature itself, in the energy, the quantum energy that organizes itself into matter.
Well, in what you just said, it sounded to me like you were implying that the lower our self-awareness, the greater our awareness of the whole.
Well, if you say lower or less distinct, absolutely I agree with you. In other words, it turns out that if you do some of the meditative disciplines and are able to achieve the nirvikalpa samadhi, all sense of self just disappears, and then there's total awareness left, just pure awareness.
You're answering my next question, because it's implied in metaphysical thought that the further that you get away from this ego construct and into this idea of the whole, that's an evolutionary step upwards.
That's right. That is absolutely right.
So there seems to be a paradox moving there.
Well, it's a paradox, but it's a paradox, as I was trying to point out before, it's a paradox of learning. We have learned how to behave in certain ways and to think in certain ways, and this ego structure that you're talking about is precisely emanating from the discovery of ourself after birth and distinguishing ourself from the environment and filling that in with all sorts of patterns of information that defines us to ourselves, and we use that to define ourselves to others as well. We call it the ego. And it gets it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that we are connected with everything in the universe, and it's these metaphysical disciplines, or spiritual disciplines, if you will, and meditation to do this has been around for a long, long time, and that if you practice those disciplines appropriately, you will indeed, in due course, experience that all that is, if you will, or being in communication with the Godhead, if you are depending upon what discipline you follow.
Right. They all seem to lead to about the same place.
They all talk about the same process. And that is precisely getting back and experiencing pure awareness. And I would say, within my model, that is when all parts of the body, all cells of the body, or most of them at least, get into resonance, ground state resonance with the 0-point field, or that from which we emerged.
We were touching upon the ideas of time within the quantum hologram, and we got involved in a lot of other talk within there. What is your idea of time? You were talking about the person who's an intuitive having an expanded sense of right now. Do you not perceive in your explorations thus far in your life as there being a past, present, and future, as being distinct delineations from one another?
Well, they are distinct delineations from one another, but the past and the present are existing. Well, the only thing that exists is right now. The past is just memory. It's just historical record. The future had been created.
Right.
So let's talk about time. Time is, nature knows nothing about time. Nature only knows about process. We humans, in our attempt to model or map and understand nature, created a concept called time.
Yes.
And it's our created concept. In other words, our universe consists of two things, it exists and we know about it. Now that's a wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and I call that a dyad. That's two facets of our universe. It exists and we know about it.
Mm-hmm.
But time has to go with our knowing. It doesn't have to do with the existence. And the reason you say this is because that the arrow of time in our universe is determined by irreversible processes, and the major processes in the universe are irreversible.
Mm-hmm.
Being born, dying, breaking an egg, mixing hot and cold water,
mm-hmm.
are all irreversible processes. They cannot be undone once they're done.
Right.
So the arrow of time is determined by that, and that is an arrow of time moves toward the future. The measure of time is just in our heads. That's a construct. We happen to measure time on our planet by the movement of our planet around the sun and the rotation of our planet on its own axis.
Sure.
And that's purely a subjective, arbitrary measure. Time really has no meaning. Now, at the subatomic level, at these quantum fluctuation levels that we're talking about, the processes are all reversible. These fluctuations come and go, and they don't change anything with regard to the structure. And so time has no meaning at that level. It simply has no meaning. It doesn't exist. You can't say it's going anywhere. The past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, but it has no meaning to say that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something we keep messing up on, because we've always thought that time, certainly in the Newtonian system, is absolutely moving forward. But the Newtonian system thinks of time as linear, that can go backward or forward.
Mm-hmm.
It's just simply not true.
And in a holographic model, there seems to be a lot more freedom to explore time in any one of its facets, whether it be
You can explore time in your mind all you want to.
Mm-hmm.
But that is, again, the mapping. In other words, one of the great errors we've continuously made as humans is confusing the map and the territory.
Mm-hmm.
There is a reality out there which we try to understand. Let's call that modeling or mapping.
Right.
But sometimes we think that our maps are absolute when indeed they're not.
Mm-hmm.
They're often faulty.
Right.
When they're not, they're faulty.
Right. And the territory is also completely unfolding on a day-by-day basis.
Exactly.
So
it's
mapping
continually evolving.
Yeah. So mapping it would be an almost impossibility unless we decided that we all in joint process decided that this is where the territory is going to exist and this is how it will exist.
And we move it in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Well,
through our creative function.
That gives us a tremendous amount of freedom and responsibility,
And responsibility goes with it.
In your personal life, in hindsight, how much do you feel that your thoughts have created the experiences that you had? I mean, for instance, as a child, did you envision that you'd one day walk on the moon?
No, not really. I didn't really start envisioning that until Sputnik went up in 1957.
I see.
And I was a Navy test pilot, and realized that humans would likely be right behind robot spacecraft, and I wanted to be there.
Mm-hmm. Was there a strong desire on your part?
Oh, yes, very strong desire. I set my course at that time to get more education, more experience, so that I would be qualified to do so.
I see.
But I come from a pioneering family. My family moved west after the Civil War and helped pioneer the West. And my grandparents and great-grandparents were part of that early culture in Texas, western Texas, eastern New Mexico, before the turn of the century. So I kind of had pioneering in my blood.
I see.
And I was fascinated by the stories of the explorers when I was a youth, and read stories about Lewis and Clark and Magellan and the great explorers of the past, and they kind of got into my thinking, I guess, and that was what tended to shape my future.
Well, there are some who would imply that that was some sort of cosmic setup that led you to your destiny.
Well, they say that, and I don't have any objection to that. It could very well be that intuitively I was influenced by being bent toward exploration and curiosity about the nature of things, that I naturally picked up on intuitively on the experiences of some great explorers in the past without being able to know it or identify it, and was guided by that. That's quite true.
But then again, you took the responsibility to follow through with this destiny where you feel maybe you could have changed it at any time.
Sure. And there's certainly in the genetic code, there is propensities. I mean, we've now used the quantum hologram to show how low-level organisms learn, how DNA learns, how the eukaryote cell learns, how the prokaryote cell learns. It's not just a random mutation, it's a learning organism. Papers have been written on it, and it's been peer-reviewed. This is becoming a concept that shakes classical dogma about how evolution progresses.
One of the things that you've also accomplished in your life was you began the organization called the Institute of Noetic Sciences. What exactly do Zions do?
Well, that was an outgrowth of my experience in space, where I was puzzled by this epiphany, this new insight, and being the curious, determined fellow that I am, I wanted to find out what that was all about.
Right.
And the Institute of Noetic Sciences was formed in 1973 to carry out and to be the mechanism by which I could carry out my investigations. And we have been doing that now for almost 25 years.
And exactly how do you carry out those investigations? Scientifically, you mean? You put them to the test?
By and large, the Institute itself has been very instrumental in sponsoring, providing seed money, providing encouragement, providing a milieu in which forward-thinking people and scientists who had experiments that they couldn't, and ideas that they couldn't really accommodate within the normal academic structure, we would help them with it. Now, by and large, I've carried out my own work on the side because I'm an integrator. I take the results of these experiments all over from all walks of science that seem to bear on this and try to weave it in, even into a new theoretical structure that says this is how it works. And I've been quite successful in doing that. That's where the dyadic model that I published in The Way of the Explorer came from, was it looking at all of the experiments that seem to bear on this subject of what is the nature of consciousness, and starting to weave a new story about it.
And with the ideas of creating our own realities and moving forward, where do you see us moving forward as a race?
Well, we're rapidly approaching what would be called in systems theory a bifurcation point.
I'm sorry?
A bifurcation point, a point of great transition. I think we can say it in many ways. The infrastructure seems to be breaking down. We seem to have we have gone as far as we can with this Newtonian Cartesian worldview. And quantum mechanics has helped us see beyond that. You know, all organizations go through an S-curve of growth. I think that's pretty well known by most people. Ideas do too. And the idea upon which Western civilization was founded began with Aristotle and Plato back in early Greece, was added to by Thomas Aquinas, was added to more by René Descartes. Then along come Newton and all the scientists of the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And that was really the operational mode. Things really were going great here for the last 400 years.
Sure.
And now we hit quantum mechanics that says, wait, you got some things that are wrong. Mind and matter aren't two separate realms, and mind interacts with matter. So that idea that spawned the rapid growth in Western civilization called the Industrial Revolution has run its course. We now recognize it's no longer true. It's not true. But we built on that. We evolved a marvelous technology and a science and technology based on it.
Sure.
But now we're having to change it. It's a paradigm shift. And it's a major one. And so we're having to accommodate that. And rushing toward that transition in systems theory would be called far from equilibrium, and we're rushing toward a bifurcation point. It's got to change. Now, how it's going to change depends upon how aware we become, how quickly we react, whether we start to resolve the problems and move to a more sustainable future. What has happened is that we're not on a sustainable path. Everything is changing at a geometric, exponential rate, and we know that cannot continue. It simply can't. So we have to create a sustainable civilization, and that means addressing all of these issues that have become known to us in the last 25 years of environmental degradation, ozone holes, species depletion, the oceans depleting, pollution growing, extinction or using up of all of our non-renewable resources, and on and on and on.
All the ramifications of the industrial movement, sure.
That means we have to create a different way of approaching this if we're going to have a sustainable civilization.
And with your exploration out there, do you find that science is starting to make that trend happen?
Well, science is providing the information, but the people are going to have to make it. It's a political, individual, and collective decision to become wise, to get away from the consumption ethic, the consumption economic, and the population explosion, all of which are interacting to drive this to the non-sustainable end of things.
Is it possible that perhaps what is happening here is that as mankind continues to evolve and these things become more and more aware to us, and we make a decision to consciously change it, that the future looks rather bright in that respect?
Can be very bright, but we're going to have to hurry along here.
Yeah.
The situation is getting rather desperate. If we keep going, we won't have any rainforest left, just like the forests of Lebanon disappeared, and many of the forests of Africa and Pakistan, etc., all disappeared thousands of years ago. They will from the rest of the earth, too, unless we get wise and stop doing it.
Well, I do see that there seem to be trends of at least awareness that these things are happening.
That's true.
And if awareness counts for anything, and conscious decisions, even from intention, count for anything, then perhaps things will work out a whole lot better than some of the doomsayers out there would have us believe.
I think it's entirely possible, and I think it's very probable. I have faith that we will do that, just that. But it's a political decision. It's a decision of the people. It is not something... Science can provide the answers as to where things are and how things are, but we are the people have to be responsible for it and make the decisions to do it.
And what advice would you give to all those who are listening in order to make that transition personally, if you give that kind of advice at all?
Well, increasing knowledge is one thing, and increasing self-awareness is another. Start to explore individual potential, recognize that the ego structure that we consider ourselves is not the highest form of knowing and understanding, that we can transcend far beyond that.
While still valuing that.
And valuing that. And when we do transcend beyond that, you start to see all the right answers. You start to see what we each need to do personally in order to contribute more fully to the stewardship of the earth and to contribute more fully to the whole. It's called what I call enlightened self-interest. We always have our self-interest, but enlightened self-interest recognizes that you're most profitable when you're making the greatest contribution to the well-being of the whole.
Well, and with that, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. You're truly a man to be admired, as I said before, or at least in my world you are. I really appreciate all the work that you have done and all the experiences that you've had, because in our concepts of interconnectivity, I know that a part of me was up on the moon with you.
That's right.
At least, and I know that the eyes of the world were up there watching, and we all stood there in awe, and we've learned a great deal about ourselves and the way that we move through life from your experiences, and continue to do so.
And that exactly, Mark, is what exploration is all about. All explorers are really looking to find out how do we fit into the greater scheme of things, and who are we, and how do we fit?
Well,
that's what it's about.
Absolutely. And with any luck, we'll all get there together.
Right.
Ed, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Mark.
Take care, sir.
Bye now.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2022, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.